Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
All right. Hello, my name is Dave Suter with Pages of Bookstore, Manhattan Beach, California. And today I am speaking with debut author Jemimah Wei about her novel, The Original Daughter, which will be released on May 6, 2025. Jemimah Wei was born and raised in Singapore and is currently a 2022 to 2024 Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. She is a recipient of fellowships, scholarships, and awards from Columbia University, the Sewanee Writers Conference, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, Singapore's National Arts Council, and more. Her fiction has been published in Guernica, Narrative, and Nimrod, among other publications. She earned her MFA at Columbia University and has worked as a host for various broadcast and digital channels, and has written and produced short films and travel guides for brands like Linnaeus, Airbnb, and Nikon. Jemimah, I'm so excited to be speaking with you today. We've interacted before on Instagram and talked once in the middle of the night, but The Original Daughter is one of those books that just makes me so happy to be a bookseller. It's going to be so much fun when it comes out to be selling it to all the customers at Pages, and I'm so excited for you.
Thank you so much, Dave. I am so happy to talk to you today. And talking to readers and booksellers is I'm starting to learn that this is part of what makes me love being a writer as well. I just remember so fondly the moment you called me with the news of Indies Introduced, and I've been so moved by your support of the book. And those were such lovely words. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think we should dive into these questions. So, The Original Daughter explores themes of identity, belonging, and family expectations that are driven by a cultural setting. It's not just a relationship between the two sisters, who are the stars of the books, Genevieve and Erin, but also the relationship with their parents, their grandparents. What inspired you to tell this particular story, and how much of it is influenced by your own experiences?
Well, so when it comes to the question of how much is influenced by my own experience, I always think to myself, they have a family, I have a family, I have feelings about my family, they have feelings about their family. So it's less like the particulars of those things and more about thinking about how I negotiate my relationships through my life. Relationships are really important to me. And about a decade ago, as there was this increasing conversation globally on boundaries and self-love and wellness, all of which I co-sign. I think boundaries are important. I started thinking more and more about how that had an impact on our formation of a self, especially as we try to navigate identity and individualism and intimacy. Because where I come from, when you love somebody, you're all up in their business, even if that makes you want to kind of die, And that to me is a really interesting dynamic. And, as I'm sure you can tell, I'm a bit of a yapper. I love to talk. And when you talk nonstop, you really notice the silences, holes in stories. And growing up, I would always run into, okay, sorry, I'm in New York. Can you hear the street traffic? So just going to acknowledge that on recording so people don't think about it in the background.
Right.
But yeah, I'm a yapper. And when you talk nonstop growing up, you really notice the silences of the holes in stories. And for me, what that meant was I kept coming up against these silences around origins, around absences in family. And I realized very quickly growing up that it was very common, not just in my extended family, but in the families around me, in the families of my friends and people I met, where children were given away and taken in. And it's not something people really like to talk about very much, but it was extremely common just a generation or two ago. And so to me, in the different drafts of this book, one thing that stayed constant was this idea of a returned family member, a returned sibling. Very early, it was a returned brother, which feels crazy right now. But yeah, I finally landed on this form of the girl that was the sister that's brought into the family, and it kind of went off from there.
And it's that relationship that Genevieve and Aaron have that really drives that book. You know, when Aaron just shows up, fully formed sister, at the age of 8, and just joins her life with Genevieve and really turns everybody's life upside down. But what I felt like I got out of the book was it was really a one-sided rivalry with Genevieve, who was so burdened by her ambition. But
Mhm.
Aaron was just thrilled to be following in Genevieve's footsteps as the younger sister, just looking up to her big sister. How did the difference in their identities really drive them and make them so different, even after when they were so close signing that contract of the sisterhood?
So one really interesting thing I wrangled with on the craft level was choosing the perspective, right? So this is a first-person book and you're very immersed in Genevieve's perspective. And her introduction of Erin is she dropped into our lives fully formed at the age of 7. But she isn't fully formed. She's a 7-year-old child. I think that's one thing that Genevieve really can't get around, which is this idea of seeing past herself and seeing past her vision of Erin. And so that limits the generosity she can have with her sister and almost with herself as well. I do think that there is this idea of like a doubling or over-identification that can come with immense, intense closeness that we often find in girlhood. I mean, maybe boyhood too. I don't know because I'm not a boy. But to me, at that age, you become so close to somebody, you really, really want to be almost like the same person. And as you try to form your individuality, that there's bound to be frictions, there's bound to be things that you don't like about each other and that you are surprised that the other person has access to that you don't, even in terms of our interiority. And learning to navigate that relationship or expand ourselves to see that that is not necessarily like the be all and end all is like an ongoing journey. So for me, it's not so much about Genevieve being burdened by ambition, though she is that as well. It's about her learning to be a self while negotiating her idea of a self. One of my very, very early notes for the novel was that these two sisters really love each other, and that is important, but they are kind of the absolute worst people to be around each other because they bring out the worst parts of themselves or they force themselves to confront their worst impulses. And so Genevieve, her relationship with Aaron forces her to confront the things that she'd rather not see about herself. She would like to have this image of herself that she's like a good sister, she's very loving, she's there for the other person. But the truth is, she, like many of us, are petty, competitive, and want to win. And you can choose to walk away from their relationship and not confront that. And maybe it's an easier life, but her love for her sister causes her to stay in their relationship and try and for me, that question was what can a relationship, what can love endure? And instead of having that generosity of self to expand her own vision and think, okay, this is something about myself that I don't love, and how can I work to encompass that and not have that negate who I am or negate my love for my sister, she chooses more destructive paths. And I think that for Erin, on the flip side of that, she has the opposite experience, right? She's come into this family, she's been abandoned, she has like a huge, this is something that forms a lot of her attachment to people. Also, she doesn't want to be left behind. She's been abandoned once before at a very young age in an experience that's extremely traumatizing when you're not fully able to understand what's happening to you. And so for her, I think for Erin, she really needs to learn how to not self-abandon in the face of conflict because she is like, I mean, to put it in a different way, she's a bit of a people pleaser. She would do anything to keep the people in her life that she loves there with her, even at her own expense. And that is something those two characters, when you put together, they kind of are both like the best people for each other and that they love each other, and the worst because they bring out each other's worst impulses.
It's incredible how you can describe that because the relationship was just so good and the characters were so fully formed. I just really enjoyed both of them throughout the story and just whatever they went through.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I lived with them for 9 years. I'm glad they're out there, and God bless.
Yeah.
Other people can have them now.
Well, thank you for both of them. They're wonderful. One of the things that was just also so great about it was the setting in Singapore, and then later when they went to New Zealand, it just plays such a significant role in the story. What was your approach to building that world, and what aspects of the place and culture were so important for you to capture?
Those two things for me were different. So for Singapore, right, it's where I was born and raised, it's where I grew up. And so there are not that many of us Singaporean writers. There are more now, but we're still a massive minority. Like, there are very, very few of us in publishing in kind of the world, and that's just a function of statistics, that we're a tiny country. And so it was important to me to capture the very specific details of the lives of these people. The like flowers they rip off the branches and eat, the noodle shop they like, the like kind of like habits or the games they play, because I don't think these are things that make it into bigger, more glitzy narratives. And I do think that if we don't capture it right now in print, immortalize it in a kind of like a separate object, the country will change and we will lose these things very quickly to the unreliability of memory. And then they get like painted over with nostalgia, which is great, but not quite accurate. And this is something I experienced greatly while growing up. Doing research for this book was so hard because Singapore changes so quickly that to fact check something that's happening that exists during this specific year, it's like 1,000,001 emails to everybody I know and their mother. Like, did this exist back then? Or had it already been determined inefficient and therefore scraped in the country? And so this sense of velocity that I grew up with gave me a sense of urgency. I really, really want to capture these things before we lose them, and we will lose them. I know that. For New Zealand, I think I was really interested in this idea of the Singaporean abroad, because as a country, we're small. We don't have a countryside. A lot of countries, you want to get away from the city, you go away, but we don't have a way to go to because we're tiny and we're a city state. Any further you go, you end up in the ocean. So a lot of Singaporeans want to leave. They want to explore the world and maybe come back and maybe not. And there are very few ways to get out, right? You have to have money, you have to get a scholarship somehow, you have to get a great job or like marry out, and a lot of that is predicated on different kinds of privilege, like intellectual privilege, family privilege. And so I really wanted to know how a girl who felt like she's at her absolute like limits can find a way to leave. And so I landed on New Zealand. And part of that really was working backwards from what I needed the story to do. I work around a really specific geographical event that happens in New Zealand that does happen in reality. And so I actually saved up to go for a research trip to Christchurch, I think in 2016 or 17, and I just walked around, did research on the geographical situation there, and then kind of talked to anybody who was willing to talk to me, and kind of put all of that into research into the novel. And that was interesting to me because I went in thinking to myself, this is going to be the other like location in my book. But then when I went there, I learned, as life does, life influences art. And so my vision of what the book could do changed as well, because I do have the sense in New Zealand that even though Christchurch is an island and Singapore is an island, they're so different. There's this sense of timelessness almost in Christchurch that I experienced as an outsider. And there's a sense of immense velocity in Singapore that then it could be just like, my biases confirming what I want to happen since I've already started working on this part of the book. But I was like, this is the perfect other country to put in my book. And then I just kept confirming that with more and more things that I developed. And yeah, this is like this sense of, having a different time chromosome to a different city or different experience, changed the way the prose moved as I revised and like wrote. And I really had to discover that as I went along in the writing.
It's really stunning how you can really feel, the humidity of Singapore and just, then the devastation that comes in New Zealand, but just the setup in her life there from the little house that she's living in. It's just so fascinating. It really made me feel like I was there, and it was really great. So
thank you.
Now your creativity spans multiple disciplines, from writing, academia, media, doing films. Similar to both Genevieve and Aaron, how did this shape your approach to their characters, and how did it influence the way you crafted this novel?
Well, one thing that I think I really share these characters is this sense of suffocation and survival. Growing up with this great desire to have a different life, and part of that is being young. Well, I'm not young anymore. When I was young, when I started the book many years ago, over a decade ago, having this sense that like I wish there were more that I could do, just having no agency over my life. Because when you're young, the external circumstances, be they like the machinations of adults or just like the life you're born into, you feel like there's no way forward. You have no control. And there was this great desire really to have a life where I'm not just trying to survive, but just thriving. And I don't think this is specific to Singapore. Even though we have an abundance of pressure cooker kids, I see this desperation across any modern capitalist society. And so with these characters, I just thought to myself, like, what are the different ways you can get out of the situation? And one thing that was really exciting about thinking about the way I grew up is that when I was young, there was no internet, there was no YouTube or Google or anything like that. And we were just flirting with this idea of something you dial up to, and when you use the internet, your parents can't get on the phone, things like that. And then suddenly, very quickly, things changed. And the advent of social media to me was so interesting because suddenly it felt like there was this new frontier. There was this new whole industry where totally untapped because it was brand new, where you could really you didn't seem to need any inherited privileges to enter. You just needed an internet connection and a really niche interest because if you like shoelaces, for example, somebody on internet is also gonna like shoelaces, and you could then make a whole living talking about shoelaces and all the different kinds of shoelaces. But that may not be true in your, everyday life. You might grow up and be like, I like shoelaces, and your classmates will be like, okay, we don't care, we like soccer. And so I thought that was just like the way the world opened up before we were aware of the dangers of what that might encompass. That was a really fertile time. And there was so much tentativeness around what commercialization would mean for that. And very quickly it did become commercialized, right? Within a decade now, the internet is mega, all the brands are everywhere. You do feel a sense of skepticism now, but back then it didn't feel that way. And I really, really wanted to put that into the book. So you mentioned my own experience, and I had a long career as a presenter. I got my start because I was scouted and asked to do a reality TV show. And I think I got really lucky because I was really young and it could have been a really bad experience. But from the start, I was scouted by a woman. I had really strong female mentors in the industry. Even though it was very difficult at a young age to suddenly be perceived so widely, I was always very protected and I had a good relationship with my team. And I don't think that that's necessarily always true. I grew up without a TV, and so I didn't have that sense of the media in my head all the time. And so media messaging became very new to me suddenly in my early 20s, which is crazy because suddenly it's suddenly this whole new world. Whereas when I was growing up, all I did was read Enid Blyton or whatever. And so I think I was a little more equipped to deal with it because it was a sudden big switch. It wasn't like I was gradually cooked in it. And I really wanted to know what it would be like, all these alternate lives, so what it could have been like in a different world where I didn't have those systems of support, where I didn't, where life was different, And I think part of the wonder of art and literature is being able to take certain questions that you have and really push them to their extreme limits. And that's what I really tried to do with this book.
It's so amazing. I mean, you really did it, and it's really great, And we kind of talked about it a little bit, just how long of a creative process this was for you. You said 10 years, and then you're even traveling to New Zealand to do research. What was the most surprising or challenging part of writing the book, and how did the story evolve from your initial idea?
I think the surprising part for me is just going to sound like a really cheesy answer, which is I'm just amazed that I have a book. I'm surprised that I finished it. It took so long. When I started it, it was contemporary, and now people refer to it as historical, which is very horrifying to me. Because in Singapore, somebody was like, "You wrote a historical novel, right?" I was like, "Absolutely not." But maybe it's true. I don't know. But I grew up in Singapore, and my vision of what it could look like to be a writer was very different. I thought I would just try and finish a book, maybe self-publish or look for someone, to take me. And I think my life was greatly changed by opportunities that came up around how to make money online and scholarships and how to, work the academic system, just basically by studying 24/7. And that to me was a big pivot and opened up my world to what being a writer could look like as a life and not just as something you do in the middle of the night when everybody else is asleep. And so that to me was just such a surprise, but it's a surprise to nobody else because other people have done it. Other people have written books and that are out in bookstores. So that to me was a great surprise. But in terms of how the story evolved, I keep thinking, because I spent so long on it and I did so many revisions, I keep thinking that it has changed so much. But I went back and looked at earlier writing all the way back from 2014, and it's kind of crazy, but all the bones of the story were there. Everything that was going to happen was already in those early drafts, all those early pieces of writing. And I just had to catch up. I had to figure out the best way to tell the story plot-wise, what best situations to put them in, and honestly, just how to become a better writer so I could handle the vision for the book. Because in 2014, I was not there, like craft-wise. I was not able to do that. So I had to catch up.
Yeah, and you said, I mean, originally there was a brother,
Yeah,
right?
nuts.
Was
So,
Aaron the brother?
huh?
Was Aaron going to be the brother?
No, 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 no. I had this idea of basically this idea of a returned sibling. And then so initially I was experimenting with the idea of like a brother that was given away and now comes back. But then the dynamics would be different, right?
Mhm.
Like for example, they would not be able to share a bed with their mom, which they do in the book. And some of that choices are made situationally. You're thinking, what situations can I put my characters in that would best bring out these questions I really want to have answered. And I don't really want to answer the question of like a brother, sister, and mom sleeping in a bed together. That's not my
Mhm.
artistic concern right now. And I think like just other things that change with just like I mean they feel really big when I'm going through them, but now in hindsight, I can see that a book didn't change that much vision wise. But one of the things is a really big thing happens in the third quarter of the book, right? And this novel was in first person the whole way. And in one draft, I switched to third person after that happened because I was like, at some point, a person breaks, a consciousness breaks, and you disassociate completely. And I wanted to see that reflected in the craft. That did not work and took a whole year of trying that out. And I was like, never mind, back to first person. But things like that. That's why it took so long. I was just trying all kinds of ways to make the story fit the best.
Wonderful. And now that the original daughter's out in the world, what do you hope readers take away from it? And what's next for you as a writer?
I've always thought about this novel as a love story, but like the most unromantic love story ever. And so I think that ends up being the question I always come back to when people read the book and talk to me about it, which is I really hope that people interrogate the particulars of their life as they're going through it, because we live in a very accelerated world. And I don't think we're meant to live at this pace, actually. I don't think human and when we live in such a ruthlessly efficient world, the things that go are the things that don't make sense on paper. And a lot of that are relationships that we can't quite justify in the moment. Um, I'm not saying I didn't go into this book thinking you must stay with the people you love or you must leave the people you love if they cross certain boundaries. But I do think that we need to think about it and not just have knee-jerk reactions based on the way our society moves so quickly. And so the thing I've really landed on is that interrogating your own life is working to understand it. It's a way of owning and reclaiming time because we can do a lot of things, but we can't go back in time. And um, I do think love and relationships are there in our lives if we want them and if we find it, like worthy to work on those things. As for what's next for me as a writer, I have been lying down a lot after finishing this book and taking a lot of naps because it was a tiring 9 years. And I just started working on something new, which I don't want to talk too much about because I'm scared of scaring it off. But I do feel really grateful to the original daughter, the novel, because I feel like finishing it gifted me a new stage of my relationship to my art. I think that when you work on one debut for a really, really long time, your identity as an artist can feel really codependent with the work. And it can feel like if the work doesn't happen, you're not an artist, you're not what you're working on is not worthy. But now finishing the book, I do feel like there's great freedom to go in different directions, to develop certain questions I have a little bit more. And I feel totally free, which is kind of great because I did feel like I was living in this world for a really, really long time.
That's amazing. And it's been just so wonderful speaking with you today. I just get your insights on such a great book and your creative process and the whole thing. I actually am very excited to read this book again. I cannot wait to get my hands on the hardback copy of it. It comes out May 6th. And thank you so much for your time today.
Dave, thank you so much. This is so wonderful.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!